Anyway, I'm going to be talking to you today about the Sussex Plan for Honeybee Health and Wellbeing, which is our applied research on honeybees. And I will mention at the end of it a little bit of apple pollination research we're doing with my PhD student here, Nick Balfour, who's sitting in the front. And we'll be here for as long as you want us. I think we're having lunch and we'll be meeting a few people. But the talk is a bit broader than that. I'll be trying to give you a broad overview, and I may have to skip some of it due to time constraints, but there's a bit of blurb on me, but we don't need to see that. But on the right, there's me holding a butterfly net. So I've been keen on insects since a very early age. Butterflies and moths started it off, and then eventually ended up doing a PhD in this place and master's degree, where I kind of transferred my interests to honeybees, and then from honeybees to all social insects. And they are very fascinating animals, the honeybees and other social insects. And this is my laboratory at the University of Sussex, where I kind of was in a way able to establish a laboratory based on the kind of model of America. That is a laboratory where you have an integrated facility, beehives, workshops, and this is just 50 yards from the main department. And we study the honeybee in the round here. We don't just study honeybee brain or something like that. We think we can do almost anything on honeybees. We might need to get some help in some areas, but you sometimes find, we study honeybees, we've got a neurobiologist, or we study honeybees, we've got a pesticide biologist. But there is such a thing as honeybee biology, and many places, I think, suffer. They don't have somebody that's trained in honeybees, and they're trying to do bee research. Indeed, DEFRA had a study last week published, and it was referred to in many places as disaster, and I think that's one of the reasons why. These are some of the people at the lab a few years ago. Come on. And we do a lot of basic research on honeybees and ants and other social insects in these areas. And I won't be talking about the basic research, but just to give you a taste of it. There on the top left, you see some work on reproductive conflict and conflict resolution, this worker policing, whereby honeybee workers stop each other from laying eggs and therefore maintain harmony in the beehive. And top right, you see what happens when the policing breaks down, where workers have laid lots of eggs, and actually the colony doesn't function properly. Down here we have another reason that we study honeybees and also ants, if you like, to study complex adaptive systems. That is, how do the many insects work together and coordinate their activities? And this is one area we were studying in ants, where they have this cooperative transport. Here they are lugging back a dead cockroach. But in the honeybee, they don't do this, but they coordinate their activities in many ways to forage efficiently. And another thing we study is nestmate recognition. Here are honeybees at the entrance of a beehive, guard bees, apprehending an intruder or a robber bee. And the guarding behavior raises many questions about how the guards recognize the intruders and exactly how picky they should be. It turns out that they're more picky when conditions are bad, and when foraging conditions are good, they're very accepting of intruder bees. Anyway, that's the basic research, which I'm really not going to tell you about, but suffice to say that the honeybee is much more interesting than just its role in agriculture. If the honeybee didn't make honey and didn't pollinate crops, people would still study it because it's such a fascinating species. But of course it does do those things, and it is very important to humans. And so for this reason, we have the Sussex Plan for Honeybee Health and Wellbeing. I should say that it probably should now be called the Sussex Plan for Bee Health and Wellbeing, because some of what we learn is important not just for honeybees. And really the plan includes disease control and resistance, and also foraging, flowers, food and farms. So it's probably in this area that I'm here today, although I'll be talking more generally. Now, of course, the honeybee makes honey, about 1 million tons per year, and in human history this has been a very valued product. It was the only pure form of sugar available in Britain until quite recently, and African pygmies, go crazy for honey. Everybody loves sweet stuff. Nowadays, of course, we have too much of it. But in the old days, we probably didn't have as much as we'd like, and honey was a very valued product around the world, wherever it was made and from whichever type of bee. And it still is a very valuable product. But it's no longer the most important thing that honeybees do for us, because really, let's face it, if we didn't have honey, we could still continue our existence. We could have many substitutes. But one thing that we don't really have a good substitute for is the pollination activities of bees on all kinds of fruits and also vegetables and other things like coffee. So this is actually an increasing value to humans around the whole world. And in Britain, the apples are actually the crop most pollinated, the most important crop where bee pollination is needed to raise the value. But we must also remember that in Britain, we import most of our fruit. And so most of the value of bees is actually pollination outside of Britain. And so we're buying fruit pollinated abroad, or coffee pollinated abroad. This is a meal. Everything in yellow has a bee connection to it. The bees may pollinate apples that you may eat in your apple juice. Most apples require cross-pollination, as you know. Coffee benefits from honeybee pollination. It increases the yield, and coffee comes from Africa, where the honeybee is native. Coffee is grown very much in South America, and what they found was as the African honeybee increased its range through America, country after country, the coffee yields went up as the African bee moved in. It wasn't as though they weren't making crops before, but the crops went up. Honey obviously is a direct product of honeybees. Margarine from oilseed rape, that can benefit from honeybee pollination, and almonds and cranberries can also benefit more directly from the pollination. It's tricky, this. And we have various people working on the Sussex plan, as shown there. Honeybee faces many challenges, and there I've listed some of them. And the ones that we're mostly studying are honeybee diseases, and also the fact that fewer flowers in the countryside due to habitat loss and so on. Insecticides are much in the news, and some of what I'm going to be talking about relates to that. But there are lots of non-issues that are often mentioned in the press. Mobile phones, global climate change. I'm not saying global climate change isn't an issue, but as the honeybee's native all the way from Norway to Africa, I don't think it's going to, be a problem if the climate does change by a few degrees. Genetically modified organisms are not grown in Europe. So when we talk about the decline in the number of beehives in Britain in the last century, we certainly can't blame these things here. Urbanisation still only covers several percent of Britain. The amount of Britain covered in concrete is only about 3%. I mean, maybe give us enough time, we'll concrete the whole country over, but we haven't done it yet. And one definite problem for honeybees are pathogens and pests, and these are honeybee specific. That means they only affect honeybees, no other species, but they do also affect honeybee species found in Asia, and we've got some new pests from an Asian honeybee, which is very similar to the bee we have, but also many old diseases which have probably been with the honeybee for millions of years. Here is one of the old ones, a bacterial infection called American Foulbrood. Very serious. It's not on people's radar at the moment, but if that ever breaks out in a big way, it's very serious. It's probably not going to happen in Britain because we have a good honeybee inspection program. But in America, where I used to live, that was a major problem that beekeepers had to worry about. This is a disease which also kills the brood honeybees, chalk brood, and this is found in practically every beehive. And we don't usually worry about it because it doesn't kill colonies, although it obviously weakens them. These are worker honeybees which have got shriveled wings due to the deformed wing virus. This came from one of my hives at the university. They were crawling around the ground. And this is, honeybee has many viruses, almost certainly have been with the honeybee for a long time. And these are reckoned to be more important now than they used to be because they're transmitted partly by the Varroa mite, and this is a new pest from an Asian honeybee, been in Britain for about 20 years. And it's becoming more of a challenge because the chemicals used to control it, like fluvalinate, a pyrethroid insecticide, the mites are mostly resistant. Now here you see female mother mites on honeybee larvae which have been removed from their cells. And each one of those mites entered a cell with a larva in it and would have a small brood of offspring. And when the adult honeybee emerged, these are actually male honeybees, drones, but when the honeybee finished its development, this female mite would have had a couple of daughters. So the population would expand. And this is really considered to be a major problem. For example, research in Switzerland and America has indicated that the presence of Varroa in large amounts is a predictor of later colony death. So this, everybody kind of in the know around the whole world reckons that this is a major problem. And the mite also can be phoretic on the worker bees. Now this is a mite, again an adult female mite, but she hasn't yet entered a cell. So she can be in one of two places. She can be on the body of a bee, or she can be in a cell with a pupa or larva. And actually she's a lot easier to kill in this position here. Now we've done some work recently where we're testing a control method against Varroa using oxalic acid. Now oxalic acid has been known for a long time to be a control method, and what hadn't been done was a proper study looking at the effects of different doses and treatment methods. Even though this is a well-known chemical to control the mites, they'll almost never become resistant to it because it doesn't have a subtle killing effect. Even though we have a national bee unit in Britain, and this mite has been in Britain for 15 or 20 years, they've never bothered to actually test this and work out the best way of controlling. So God knows why this doesn't get done and why people like me end up doing it 15 years after it comes to the country. But with one of my PhD students, we decided to do it, and we looked at three methods. Dribbling, where literally the oxalic acid in solution with sugar is dribbled onto the exposed bees after taking the lid off. So this is the beehive when the lid has been removed, and we just literally pour the liquid over the bees so it gets on their bodies and harms the mites. Here we really do the same thing, but we also take the frames out of the hive and actually use one of those spray misters so we can actually get it on the bees a bit more. And then here's a new method called sublimation, where a heated iron operated off a car battery evaporates a small amount of oxalic acid and turns it directly into a gas. And here the advantage, of course, is that we don't have to open the beehive. And I should say this was done in January, not necessarily the easiest time of year to open beehives because you've got to find a reasonably good day, and it's this takes 5 or 10 minutes. This takes very little time at all. So we tested those methods, and sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button here. We also took samples of bees, very low tech. This is actually a hose pipe attachment, and here we have a sample of worker bees we collected out of the colony, froze them, and then we extract the mites literally by using a jet of water. And here's the PhD student Hassan from Syria. I always like to say, how is it that the Syrian government, which is actually having a civil war, how come they're the people funding research on bee diseases? But that's what's actually happening. And then the mites are trapped, dead mites, they're strained out, and then we can count the mites and count the bees. And this is my beekeeper, Luciano. So he's from Italy. So we're a very international group. So we can basically work out how many mites per 100 bees. And these are some of the results we've got. Here's Varroa mortality on this vertical axis here. This is 100% mortality and no mortality. And we can sample the bees twice, so we can work out how many mites per bees before treatment and how many after. The control, there's very little mortality, and all three methods can give high mortality, up to nearly 100%. But as you'll see, the sublimation method gives the highest, and also the widest group of doses. Here, this is too low and it gets to be quite good. Here, the sublimation method actually is the most effective, and also it has the lowest mortality on the bees. I won't go into this, but I'll just say the mortality on the bees is negligible. In fact, the sublimation, actually, the mortality of the treated colonies is actually lower than the control colonies. So effectively, no cost. And so the sublimation method turns out to be the quickest and easiest. It gives the highest mortality to the mites, the lowest mortality to the bees, and it costs all of 10p per hive. So we've done that, and we're going to give that to the beekeepers. And so what we have now is a good method. But this method only kills the mites which are on the bees themselves, on it's not going to kill the mites which are in the cells, and that's the one problem with this method. But it's not really a major problem because we just kill the mites in the winter. That's why we did it in January, because the proportion of mites on the worker bees versus in the brood cells is quite low in the summer and here in early autumn, because the colony is rearing a lot of brood and most of the mites are breeding the brood cells. But as the winter approaches, brood rearing goes down until, in this case in December, there's very little brood rearing and almost all the mites are in an exposed position where we can easily kill them. So this method is a good method for controlling the mites, provided you use it at the correct time of year. Another thing we're doing is breeding hygienic honeybees. Here we are, the beehive has been opened and frames have been taken out, and these contain brood. This patch here in the center is brood, whereas this is honey. These cylinders are placed into the frames and an amount of liquid nitrogen is put into these cylinders, and it kills a circular patch of brood. These frames then go back into the beehive for 2 days and are removed again. And we determine what proportion of these dead cells have now been cleaned out. Now, many diseases of honeybees are brood diseases. And if the bees are very hygienic, they reduce the spread of these diseases. And what we find, before we freeze it, and then 2 days later, this patch here, these all in the center were killed, and as you can see, they've mostly been removed. This is mostly empty space. There's a few which remain. So this is a hygienic colony, whereas over here is a non-hygienic colony. All of these in the center are dead, but very few of them have been removed. Now, hygiene is a heritable trait. You can breed for it, and indeed we developed a new way of breeding honeybees. I won't go into the details, but specifically for hygienic behavior. And so this is an opportunity to make British bees more hygienic. About 10% of the honeybee colonies in Britain or anywhere else where they've been studied are hygienic. The trait exists, but it's generally rare, but you can breed for it. So you can increase the amount of hygiene in colonies managed by beekeepers who go through queen rearing and that kind of thing. And just to tell you a bit more about it, these are some hives from a local beekeeper, actually my beekeeper Luciano, and each one of these is a different honeybee colony, and here is a percentage of brood removed. So about a third of Luciano's hives are hygienic, above the 90% level, and this is because for a number of years he's been breeding for low chalk brood. He was breeding his colonies to select and rear queens from the colonies that had little chalk brood. What he was actually doing was breeding for hygiene. And this also occurred in America many years ago, where a beekeeper was breeding for low amounts of this disease called American Foulbrood, which he succeeded in doing. And what he'd actually been breeding for was hygiene. So hygiene is a defense mechanism which honeybees naturally have. Every organism has defense mechanisms against pests and diseases. Here we're just trying to beef up what the bees do naturally by selective breeding. Now that's finished on diseases, and now I want to talk about another definite problem, which in many ways is more serious, because even if we could cure all honeybee diseases, they still got to eat. And it's worth remembering that every living thing, or maybe not every plant, plants don't eat, but they need resources, and every animal has got to feed. And there's such a thing in ecology as carrying capacity. I think the number of bees in Britain is about right for the amount of flowers we've got, because with intensification of agriculture, there's been a great reduction in the flowers in the countryside and the habitats that all types of wild animals need. And it affects not just the honeybee, but many species. If there aren't many flowers in the countryside, that won't just affect honeybees. As I said before, honeybees have diseases which affect only them, but the lack of resources and flowers is going to affect wildlife much more generally. We have, for example, far fewer hay meadows. Even common wildflowers like knapweed here. I mean, the honeybees don't need to be foraging on rare orchids. In fact, they don't make any nectar. What they want is common plants, like even ragwort they will forage on. But this is just black knapweed. Nobody's worried that black knapweed is going to go extinct as a wildflower in England. But this species provides nectar, not just for honeybees, but for many species. So this is what bees can forage on, and this is becoming much harder to find. And part of our research, or a lot of our research, also involves this, the honeybee waggle dance. This is a unique behavior of honeybees whereby this forager, who's returned to the colony, she's making a communication dance and telling these other bees where she's been foraging, so we can monitor the bees' waggle dances and study their foraging ecology. It's a bit like every bee tells you where she's been foraging. Nowadays, people attach GPS data loggers onto penguins or God knows what, puffins or penguins or, you know, kangaroos, and then they can figure where they've been. Well, the honeybee is the only animal which you don't have to do that because they just tell you. Let's see if this will run. No, you obviously don't have QuickTime loaded on your computer here. Now, the waggle dance was discovered by Karl von Frisch. You would have just seen a nice video of the waggle dance, and he actually won a Nobel Prize for his discovery. Here he is with bees at a feeder. They would forage for syrup at this feeder at a known location, and when they went back to the hive, he could monitor their dances and know that this dance was for this precise location. We videotaped the waggle dances using glass-walled hives in the laboratory. We then decode the dances on computers, running the dances very slowly, frame by frame, in a computer program called QuickTime or Final Cut Express. We can measure the angle of the dance, because it's the angle of the dance that gives the direction, and the speed of the dance which gives the distance. And we can tell where the bee, we can basically listen to bee language. And this is some data we've got. And what we have here is 2 years of data starting in August 2009. Let's just start here. And it goes on until the autumn, till the winter. Then it takes a break and it starts again in March 2010. Takes a break for the winter, and then it starts again. So this is 2 years of data. When nobody's ever done this before. But for 2 years we monitored where the bees were dancing. And what you see here is the average distance indicated by the dances. And what you see is the seasonal cycle of it going up and down. This is showing it in area. It's really the same thing, but now shown in area. And what you see is actually the bees forage at the longest distances in the summer and the least in the spring. And that's telling us that it's more challenging for bees to find food in the summer. This is an integrated picture of a bee's eye view of how good the environment is for its food. That would integrate everything, including the number of flowers, the availability of flowers, but also the competition from other bees. Maybe there's more flowers, but if there's more bees also, because colonies are expanding in the summer, there'll be more competition. So this is telling us that actually the time of year that the bees need help here in Sussex is the summer, but more generally it's telling us to help bees by giving them more food. We don't have to help them throughout the whole year. There might be just a few months. And in Sussex and probably most of England, it's the summer. The foraging range is enormous. This is the 90th percentile. And in August, 50 square kilometres was the foraging range of a colony. This is what it looks like plotted onto a map. Here you can see a little bit of the English Channel, a little bit of blue sea there, and the Brighton Pier. The university's here, and in the summer you see they're foraging over a large area. This is 5 kilometres and this is 3 kilometres. This is a white circle containing 50% of the foraging, and here a white circle containing 90%. And you can contrast that to this spring where the foraging is much more concentrated. And this is just showing you the bee's eye perspective of the landscape and where they have to go to forage. Now, bees are very smart in their foraging. They don't go 3 kilometres if they don't have to. All kinds of research has shown that bees forage in an economically savvy way. So if they go 3 or 5 kilometres, that means that they need to. It means that there aren't as many flowers. In the spring, there's a lot of flowers around, and that's probably why they don't go very far. Dandelions, for example. In the autumn, ivy, a plant that most people don't even realize has flowers on it, is so abundant that honeybees collect 90% of their pollen from ivy in the autumn. 90% from ivy, and indeed only 20% of the bees were collecting pollen at all. 80% of foragers on ivy were collecting only nectar. So ivy, as a sort of single-handedly almost, is holding up the foraging ecology of many insects in the autumn, and not just honeybees, many other insects too. If you're flying in the autumn and you're an insect, you're probably heading for the nearest ivy bush. Whereas the summer, the living may not be so easy. This is what you might see in the summer, lots of green grass. That might have used to have been a meadow full of flowers. Now it's a meadow full of grass. Nothing wrong with grass, it feeds the sheep, but it doesn't feed the bees. Now that we know that the summer is an important time for bees, we've been doing some work on garden plants in the summer and also wild plants. I'll start by telling you about the garden plants. Now, this is a local park, and that looks like a bee paradise, doesn't it, or a butterfly paradise. What could be better than to be in this garden, either as a bee or as a human? If you're a human, you can lie on the grass and look at the flowers, and if you're a bee, you can visit the flowers and collect nectar and pollen. So we did a survey of that garden, and this is what we found. There were 80 varieties of flower in full bloom in August last year. Here is a number of flower varieties in a particular category of attractiveness. We found that only 3 of the 80 plants were excellent for bees, attracting in the region of 160 insects per meter squared in 5 measures over 2 days. A snapshot is just when you go to a patch of flowers and you count all the insects. 24 out of the 80, we never saw a single insect on them. Not a single insect. And another 36, nearly 45%, had virtually none. So this garden, beautiful though it is, was mainly consisting of sort of what I call plasticated plants. Plants which have been bred to have gaudy colours, and all the naughty bits that the bees need to get pollen or nectar are probably non-existent or buried away. So I think that shows that we can do a lot better in gardens. And here's another project we've done which tells us more of the same. Here we have a deliberately planted garden at the university, and here this undergraduate summer helper is making a snapshot. You know, for example, going to this patch here of a certain dahlia or lavender and counting all the insects, and she goes to the next patch and works her way around. And there were 32 summer flowering varieties, all of which are considered to be attractive, easy to buy, cheap. Basically the kind of thing that you could easily get hold of, stick in your garden. And what did we find? Well, this is showing the types of insects in the main garden, and there were 2 other gardens we studied, but this tells you what insects were there. The yellow is the honeybees, so roughly a quarter or a third of the insects we saw on these garden flowers were honeybees. Bumblebees were extremely numerous. Of course, there's 20 species in Britain, but bumblebees were nearly 50%. So between honeybees and bumblebees, that was about 80% of everything that we saw. There are also other types of bees in red, hoverflies in green. Hoverflies after bees are the most important flower visitors. Butterflies relatively uncommon, 1 or 3%, even though we're in a very good place for butterflies, and then all other insects 3%. So certainly if you plant garden flowers, the bees will come. Honeybees can forage many miles. Butterflies, you know, it's questionable whether they'll come. If they're not there, they can't come. So that tell you bees will come. And now this is the attractiveness. Now don't worry about the names of the species. These are 32 species, and in this year, 2012, they're ranked in their attractiveness. So this is the mean number of insects per square meter per snapshot. So that would mean this particular variety, on average, anytime we looked at that patch, there would be 7 insects on the patch, which was 1 square meter. Whereas this plant here, our dear little pelargonium, you all know pelargoniums, much so-called geraniums, much beloved of corporation gardens, are practically useless for insects. I think in 2 years we saw 1 insect, whereas some of these are very attractive. And the take-home message here is very simple. The garden plants vary 100-fold in how attractive they are for insects. So again, there's a huge opportunity to make gardens more insect friendly, because these are all the same cost, just as easy to grow, just as pretty, available in your garden centre, and you can choose a plant which is 100 times better than the worst at no cost. This is a no-cost option to help bees in your garden. And of course, these are summer flowering plants, which, as I've told you, is the important month to help the bees. Lavender was especially good for bumblebees, but did attract honeybees and other species like butterflies. Borage was especially good for honeybees. So the different plants are not all quite the same in terms of the insects they attract. So by the right selection of plants, you can help hoverflies, butterflies, honeybees, bumblebees. Basically, you can help the lot. Dahlias were an interesting case. They're much beloved of gardeners. And these two here were very good because they've got fairly normal flowers, even though they are highly bred to have weird colours. Whereas these varieties here, which are of either the cactus morphology or the pom-pom morphology, were practically useless. And you can immediately see why, because the way they've been bred is such as to sort of eliminate the individual florets which are providing nectar and pollen to bees. Lavenders, we originally planned the project to compare lavenders because I saw this display in the Hampton Court Flower Show, and I thought, God, I hope they haven't bred all these weird lavenders to have some of them which are not very good for bees. And this was a display from Downderry Nursery, just a few miles from here in Kent, who's a national lavender collection and also a lavender nursery. And we compared many lavenders, and I'm happy to say that the white lavenders are just as good as the blue lavenders, which of course is the natural colour. But we did some other work on lavender, and I'll just mention some of this. And this is a correlation of the two main types of bees, honeybees per metre squared and bumblebees per metre squared on the 32 plant varieties. And there's actually no correlation. It looks like, you know, where the bumblebees forage is very different to where the honeybees forage. And indeed, that's true on this data set. But we have to remember that there's actually competition going on. And on this plant variety here, lavender variety Grosso, when we excluded the bumblebees, the honeybees showed up in large numbers. So this isn't saying that all of these plants are either a honeybee plant or a bumblebee plant. It's actually telling us that maybe the bumblebees are out-competing the honeybees or vice versa. And I'll just show you a bit of data collected by Nick here, my student who I've been supervising, to go into this in more detail. Competition between bumblebees and honeybees on lavender, and what we found was that honeybees were much slower at handling each lavender flower, taking an average of 3.5 seconds versus roughly 1.25 seconds on average for bumblebees. 3 different species, and these were not significantly different. So it turned out that the bumblebees were more efficient at foraging on lavender, taking less time. And the reason for that was because they have longer tongues. The bumblebee tongues are in the order of 7.5 or more millimeters long, whereas the honeybee is just a bit shorter at sort of 6 to 7. But as it happens, the corolla tube of these flowers was just right in the critical zone at 7 millimeters. So the honeybees are a bit short on tongue length. And so we thought, well, how can we test that? How can we do an experiment? And this is what was done. We actually made the lavender flowers shorter by making a cut with the scissors, so it made the flower more accessible. And this was a control which made a cut in a place which would have no effect. And what was found was that the honeybees actually foraged more rapidly, taking only 0.76 seconds to suck up the nectar versus 1.11 in the control when the flower had been shortened, but there was no effect on the bumblebees. So we were able to show here that the honeybees were particularly handicapped by the depth of the flower, although the bumblebees were still much quicker. When you look at honeybees foraging, it's almost as though they're trying to jam their head in all the way, you know, as if you're trying to reach something behind a sofa and you try and stick your body in, and even so you can hardly touch what you want to reach. When you see honeybees foraging on lavender, this is kind of your impression. And this photograph shows it, whereas the bumblebees are a bit more slack in the system. And then we got to thinking, well, maybe the fact that the honeybees are less efficient means that the bumblebees are out-competing them. If the bumblebees can forage more efficiently on the lavender, they will show up in large numbers and keep the nectar levels down such that the honeybees just don't bother. And so here we have a patch of lavender using a very high-tech implement. We're actually excluding honeybees from this patch. If you give the bee a little tap with the stick, it goes away and doesn't come back. So actually you can manage patches of flowers to exclude whatever you want just by whacking them. In fact, we don't hurt the bees. So we had a bumblebee exclusion patch, a honeybee exclusion patch, and a control patch. And these are grosso. I think we spent £1,000 on lavender. We've still got it, actually. So we're planning many more experiments with our £1,000 worth of lavender. We've already done 2 on it. And, oh, this seems to, yeah, well, anyway, it's not working. Your wonderful Bill Gates designed computer isn't showing my data, but I was going to show you some data there which showed that when we excluded the bumblebees, the honeybees showed up in huge numbers. Take away the bumblebees, and we get 20 times as many honeybees on the lavender. So lavender isn't a plant which honeybees don't like. They love it. But if the bumblebees are there, they will have really depleted the nectar to a level that it makes it less advantageous for the honeybees. Now, moving on to the countryside and helping the bees in the countryside on farmland, the data here that I showed you before shows that in the summer there's a hot spot in this vicinity here. This is the laboratory where the bees are, and about 2 kilometers to the southeast there's this hot spot of foraging, and it's consistent year to year. So we went there to see why the bees there. The bees have told us we are foraging in a certain place, but they didn't tell us what they were foraging on. So then we go there and do a ground survey, and this is what we find. There's Nick doing his ground survey, or smiling sweetly, and we've got downland here, mostly grassland and different habitats. This is actually pasture land. You can see a lot of clover here. There's also a nature reserve and various other habitats. And what in this habitats there's all kinds of wildflowers, including black knapweed. And what you see is black knapweed is attractive to honeybees, but also, and this is greater knapweed, to other species. This is greater knapweed, and you see a honeybee and a bumblebee foraging side by side. And here the point is that what's good for honeybees is probably going to be good for other species. So although I do want to help honeybees, I don't exclusively want to help them. And I think the honeybee dance is telling us not just what's good for honeybees, but what is good foraging for other species as well. And of course, Lepidoptera like the burnet moth or the marbled white butterfly also forage on these species of wildflowers. And in this area, classified 4 habitat types, or 4 more main types: the nature reserve or site of special scientific interest. There was also field margins, set aside, and pasture, i.e. just grazing land. And the grazing land was full of clover and other legumes. But when the number of insects were counted, this is number of insects counted in 100 meters squared of transect, so 50 meters by 2 meters, it's amazing to see how many more insects were in these 2 habitats than these 2 here, about 20 times more. And also that the field margins were just as good as the nature reserve, whereas the fields full of clover were actually practically useless. I mean, I don't know why, because clover is often very attractive to bees, but in this instance there were virtually none on it. So this is telling us in this habitat, in this general vicinity, which particular habitats were good. And now when we go and look at plant species, here are 5 plant species mentioned, and black knapweed, for example, the common knapweed, was found in very commonly in the pastures and in this SSSI nature reserve. And you can see it was attracting here yellow for honeybees, orange for bumblebees, blue for butterflies and moths, and green for hoverflies. And so this species, which is good for honeybees, was good for other species as well. Here the mix was slightly different, more bumblebees, but the same general types of species. Bramble was very common in the field margins, and this is also a very good plant. The clover, which we would have thought would have been good, was really pretty hopeless. And hogweed, which was another plant found very much in field margins, but in other places too, attracted a lot of hoverflies. So we're getting a handle here of the subhabitats and the plant species that are really providing the ecosystem service for the pollinating insects. And what the pollinating insects or bees want, not just pollinating, flower visiting, is lots of common flowers. They're not after the rare orchids, they're after the common stuff. Now, staying with the honeybee dance, we're potentially interested also in the effects of insecticides, and therefore we studied foraging of honeybees on oilseed rape. Oilseed rape is a crop grown throughout the country, including Sussex. That's the long man of Wilmington, near where I live, just 10 or 15 miles from the university, the second largest depiction of a human figure in existence. And oilseed rape is hugely increasing crop in the country. Look how it's more than doubled in acreage in the last 30 years, and it's rivaling now barley. And it's increasing because it's a good crop for farmers to grow. They make good money. It's used in cooking oil, margarine, and even diesel engines. And the yields are going up as well. It's treated with insecticides. These show the proportion of treatments of different insecticides, and these all include a neonicotinoid insecticide. And one thing you do notice that's interesting is this imidacloprid here, which many of the scientists study, hasn't been used for 4 years. So all kinds of people are studying a non-existent problem because this is no longer used. But there are really a couple of main ones which are used. And very low doses are found in the nectar and pollen. We don't know if it's harming the bees or not. But there is a very minute amount in the nectar. But because oilseed rape has flowers, it's an obvious way in which bees can contact the chemical. If you treat wheat or some other plant that bees don't forage on, it's not going to affect bees in nearly the same way as if you treat a plant which has flowers that bees visit. And this oilseed rape is by far the most important flowering crop in Britain. Sunflowers, for example, are hardly grown in Britain. If you lived in France, maybe they would be more important. So we surveyed oilseed rape from the air, rented an aeroplane and a pilot, I should say, and I didn't trust either of these two characters to fly the plane for me, my PhD students. And there's the university. That's where my lab is, by the way, and this is the new football stadium of the local football team. The university's here. This is the town of Lewes, and you can see patches of oilseed rape. Very easy to spot. By the way, also flew over here as well. And this is the university here, and this is the city of Brighton. The oilseed rape is shown. Every dot is a decoded dance. The first thing we found is that the 3 beehives located in Brighton did not forage at all on oilseed rape. The nearest fields were several miles away, and they just didn't visit at all. So one of the things we found is that we have locations where bees don't forage on oilseed rape. This is very important because a recent government study, DEFRA study, on bumblebee foraging on oilseed rape, they cocked the whole thing up because they had bees too near fields that they could forage on, so they couldn't have a control where there was no foraging on treated fields. We've found this because we've been doing background research. But even the university hives, which have a lot of oilseed rape around them, we reckon that only 10 or 20% of the foraging was on oilseed rape. So if oilseed rape is a problem to bees, our data indicates that it's maybe less of a problem than we might think, because it's not as though all of the foraging is on it. In fact, rather little of the foraging is on oilseed rape, almost certainly because in the spring there are many other flowers that the bees can visit. We also collected pollen samples. This is the entrance of an observation hive. The observation hive is on the other side of the wall, and by putting a mesh over the entrance, and you can do this for a normal hive as well, you can trap pollen grains. There's pollen grains, and then we also analyze them, and we reckon using pollen analysis that roughly 10% was from oilseed rape. So that matched very well of our data from dancing. So from both the study of pollen and the study of dancing, it seems that rather little was on oilseed rape. It looked like 3% and now this says I've got this wrong way around, that should be urban. It looked like 3% of the foraging from the urban hives was an oilseed rape. But I think this is because oilseed rape has pollen which very similar to some wild species in the cabbage family. So I think there's a 3% kind of error in our estimation. But anyway, the point is rather little foraging on oilseed rape, even in hives which are near it. Moving on now until the end of my talk, for the last 5 minutes, crop pollination, blueberries and apples. You've been waiting for the apples, right? In fact, come to that. By the way, this is almonds, which needs 1 million beehives a year to pollinate the almonds. Almonds are like apples on steroids when it comes to the flowering, of course, in the rose family. And I used to live out there in California, and I used to do this myself. So I'm a kind of a hands-on professor, and I had one time 180 beehives in a truck, and I would do almond pollination contracts and felt I kept my hand in. It was very interesting. It's also interesting to see all the scientists telling you this, that, and the other who have no practical experience of what they're talking about. So I've practical experience of beekeeping and pollination as well as research experience. But anyway, this is like the big daddy of all pollination events involving 1 million hives and a rental fee of $150 to $200 pollinating what is the largest crop grown in California in terms of its value. Here's a blueberry farm in Surrey, Britain's largest blueberry grower, and there's Nick again, and we're talking to the farm manager, Andres. Nobody who works on this farm is English other than the guy who owns it. They're all Polish or Bulgarian or something like that. But anyway, that's how you get smart people, I guess, Poles. Anyway, he speaks beautiful English, and here are 10 bumblebee colonies pollinating field blueberries, actually grown hydroponically. And we are starting a project this spring. This is just pilot work. But we did find something, quite interesting, and that even though this farm had hundreds of bumblebee colonies costing about £20,000 a year, honeybees were much more numerous. And on the 4 varieties here of blueberries, we counted the bees, honeybees and bumblebees, and actually found that 2/3 of the bees were honeybees, even though the farmer was spending a fortune on bumblebees. And indeed, there are also wild bumblebees. So not all of these bumblebees are the ones he bought. This year, we're planning to do an experiment using cages, big cages, to determine to what degree blueberries require pollination. And in particular, can he improve his crop by enhancing pollination? Blueberries are a new crop in Britain, and the people who are growing them don't really know it all. You know, he's of the opinion, the farmer, that his yield can be increased significantly by getting his pollination right. We don't know if that's the case or not, but we don't know enough about new crops, and that's something perhaps worth remembering in a place like this, that apples are a fantastically important crop, but they're fairly well understood, whereas there are new crops coming on all the time. And now, finally, in apple orchards, the idea here, these are the farms we're working on just a few miles south of here in Five Oak Green, Moat Farm, and across the road, Capel Grange Farm. That's Moat Farm from the air. After photographing the oilseed rape, we flew over Tunbridge Wells and Kent and photographed all the apples, and those are the farms we're working on. And it's interesting to note these are apples and this is oilseed rape. So apple is competing with other plants for pollination. There's the apples in bloom in the spring, and these are pear trees, but the beehives in this particular farm, Moat Farm, they actually pay beekeepers to move hives in, whereas Capel Grange Farm, they don't. You know, it's kind of interesting, just 2 sides of the road, and one farmer rents them and the other farmer doesn't rent them. We set up observation hives in this shed in Moat Farm, and we also provided our own shed in the other farm. These are observation hives inside the shed, and this is our own expensive. How much should we pay for that shed, Nick? Can you remember? How much? 200. Is it as cheap as that? I'll buy another one then. And there's Nick's funny little van pickup truck. But anyway, we put observation hives in here. The reason there's bees all over this shed is that this was just minutes after we moved them in. They were a bit confused. And we monitor the bees and videotape their dances and decode them. And this project we've got 1 year's data, and we're going to start it again in a few weeks because Nick's getting a second year. And this is just information on the types of insects on the flowers. And you can see honeybees were 61% of the insects seen on the flowers of 4 varieties of apple and also pears. Solitary bees were next most important, then bumblebees, then flies. So the honeybees were significant in their abundance. Those are the main categories of insects: flies, wild bees, and so on. And we've only just really started doing this, and I don't want to make too big a deal of it for now, but here is an aerial photograph of the 2 farms. The beehives are here. I think, Nick's, why did you choose a 7-sided polygon instead of a 6-sided? Because 6-sided, a hexagon, is symbolic of the honeybee, but this is, anyway, this indicates the farm and where the apples are in white, where the beehives are in white also, and the dots are where we've decoded dances. And it's interesting to see that they don't necessarily forage inside the area that needs pollinating. And so what we're using is the waggle dance to tell us more about where the honeybees are actually foraging. We're also collecting pollen samples so we can understand better about how bees are using the orchards or not using the orchards. Because with apple pollination, some farmers have bees, some don't. Some don't think it's necessary, some do. But in any event, to know more about where the bees are foraging will enable us to use whatever bee resources we do have in a better way. And I think that completes my talk. Thanks for your patience.